was going on this trip all over, through Israel. I saw, Muslim women wearing headscarves. They're driving, Teslas and Porsches and Ferraris. The Arab Muslims who live in Israel and who are normal, not radicalized, they'll never want to move from Israel. That's the greatest country in the world for them, you know. But the ones like in the section of Gaza, they could have turned Gaza like into another Dubai. They took those billions and billions in dollars in aid for like the last 20 years, and they turned it into a graveyard terrorist cemetery. I'm in Los Angeles, and I used to live in this one building, and there was a woman there, and she was Ukrainian. And she's like, well, because you're from Ukraine, you have to say Slava Ukraini. But it's like, what people don't realize, including a lot of celebrities that I see seeing this, is that Slava Ukraina is pretty much like the Ukrainian Heil Hitler. I mean, these are people who are very intelligent. And instead, after 30 years, actually, probably more, when the Soviet Union came down, most of the country, it's poverty. You've got a small percentage that's very wealthy. Who stole all that money in the last 30 years that they were getting from international aid? I'm walking in Beverly Hills here in Santa Monica, and there's a lot of young Ukrainian men fresh off the boat. They're shopping at Gucci, they're shopping at Fendi, they're shopping at Armani, they're driving expensive cars, and none of them are serving in the Ukrainian army. They all took off.
I'm Dr. Randy Bock. I'm honored today to have Yuri Rutman with me today. He's a media guy, entrepreneur. I met him on LinkedIn, and he's fairly active and vocal. He has opinions, so that's something we like here. Yuri, what are your opinions, and what are you thinking about today?
Well, you know what? Considering I've got racing thoughts a million miles a minute, I have an opinion that comes up faster than I could catch it. So I've got a lot of different opinions on a lot of different things. So, I know we're going to talk about different topics. So whatever you wanna, shoot at me first, I'll grab it and I'll run with it.
Okay, so I followed some of your posts on LinkedIn. Um, LinkedIn is I guess owned and run by Reid Hoffman, who's on the left. But I've noticed there's a lot more liberty with posting things that are not from the left. I actually had my profile taken down when I had an interviewee like this who said, it's about 2-3 years ago, who said that kids shouldn't get the COVID vaccine. And I was just kind of boom, eliminated, disappeared from LinkedIn without any kind of foothold to get back on. I screamed about it on other platforms, and mysteriously I got popped back in. No explanation or anything like that. What's the mood on LinkedIn these days, and what type of things do you like to post?
Well, it's interesting because I thought that most of like the garbage noise that people are posting, whether it's very anti-Semitic or just a complete distortion of the facts, I normally thought that I would see it mostly like on Facebook and Instagram. Historically, I always thought LinkedIn would be a very focused, business networking and deal making platform. But what I'm seeing is it's become just like a hotbed for a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of anti-Israel, posts, the same type of, brainwashed 72 virgin wannabes that are, marching in the streets and, saying from the river to the sea, you see them constantly just posting disinformation on there. I mean, I've had some interesting arguments with some people um, about it. It wasn't even arguments; they were arguing with me. I was just trying to lay out facts, about Israel, and they're talking about how it belongs to the Palestinians, and how the Arabs were there first. So I kind of had to break down certain historical facts. And it's interesting that a lot of these people that I was, I guess, having well, I call it a dialogue. They call it, I don't know what they call it, but a lot of them are from places like Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, And a lot of their arguments are based on, I guess, what they were taught is their interpretation of Islam, what's in the Quran, and history. But what they're taught, it's completely not in the Quran. I mean, it's not in Islam. When everyone is saying how, like, it's just mind-boggling how a lot of people who are so pro-Palestinian and saying it's in the Quran, it's Allah's or God's wish, for us to be, that Palestine is ours. And there's 42 surahs or more in the Quran that specifically say that Israel, it's for the children of Israel, it's for the Jews, it's specifically in there. Not one time is Jerusalem mentioned in the Quran. Palestine is never mentioned in the Quran. Yet somehow, with their upbringing, whatever they're taught, it's a very distorted view of reality, and it's just mind-boggling how they believe in it. And a lot of times, the people that I'm talking to, you think they're educated. I look at their profiles. They say, senior data scientist, physician, software engineer. Well, I mean, they might be educated about the nuts and bolts of what they do, but their ideologies are so, at the end of the day, it's really rooted in a concept that we call hate without reason. And what you're seeing on LinkedIn, and I think a lot of social media, is like a lot of people, it's easier to hate without reason than to, I think, love with facts. So that's kind of what I'm seeing that's kind of like what I'm seeing on there.
Yeah, no, it's a whole sadness. I saw this video. I think I bookmarked it on X. I'm not sure when it was made. Probably, I think in the 90s. There's a professor in Egypt, and he's saying that it's not a land for peace kind of thing. That's absurd. This is always will be and always has been a religious war. And what he says, and he's not an Islamist. He's kind of wearing a jacket and tie, and seems Western oriented, if there's such a thing there. And he said, look, if tomorrow all the Jews in Israel converted to Islam, there'd be no war. We wouldn't be taking anything over. And that it's the other that we're all, the Islam is always fighting against anybody who's not Islamic, and that's been the culture, that's been the history, that's been the I don't know if you want to call it successful, but it's certainly been the movement that emanated from seventh or eighth century, Arabian Peninsula and beyond. So the Islam is everywhere, and really without stop. Um, and as long as people convert, then they're not your enemy anymore. So it's kind of a team sport, I think. I grew up in New York City, and we were Yankees fans. I've been in Boston for 40 years, and my kids are Red Sox fans. One of my brothers thinks it's a total traitorous, treasonous, seditious thing for me to have Red Sox fans in my house. It's like it's a team sport, and there's been a lot of money from that same Arabian Peninsula for other reasons, for oil and whatnot. And starting, in the 1970s, they took over Aramco and whatnot. The money's been just there. And Saudi was a pretty depopulated place when I was growing up. And populations have grown, and the money was there, and they've spread Wahhabism and Islamic thoughts out throughout the Ummah. The whole Arabian Islamic kind of consecrated world from Indonesia, to Mauritania, whatever. So back and forth. Now it's a bigger world. It seems like their fact stream, as it were, comes from a certain place, not of facts, but of propaganda.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if you look at, it's interesting. So, and we'll get to more of my history. So, I'm from Ukraine. I was born in Kiev during the Soviet Union times, and my family and millions of others' families. I mean, the level of anti-Semitism that was there, it was just far-reaching in terms of, like, collectively, like the former Soviet Union and the former Russian republics. On the flip side, I know a lot of people, like, from, like, Jews from like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where they were living side by side with with Muslims, and they really didn't have that much. They didn't get it as bad, as in terms of. So I think what happened is kind of going back to what I'm saying. I think like the twisted nature, and I mean you could see this in any religion, but you know the fact is there's what, like 1.5 billion Muslims. And I was reading some reports. They were like saying, some intelligence reports are saying that something like 20% of them grew up with a radicalized perception of Islam. That's like about 300 million people. That's not a good, I mean, that's probably about the population of the United States. So when you have about maybe, you know, 1.2 million people who are taught a more, I guess, traditional, I guess, in their mind, pacifist, um, you know, views on religion, but you've got 300 million that want to, you know, kill the rest of the world if you don't follow them. That, I mean, that's like a big problem. That's a problem. And the other issue is like you're saying, well, I mean, in terms of you know, if Jews were to convert to Islam in Israel, there would be no war. Well, of course there would be. I mean, how do you define, Al Qaeda and Taliban and ISIS and Syria and all the? I mean, they're killing everyone. So when you have, and no one's protesting in the streets about Muslims getting killed or getting massacred now in Syria under this new regime. So it's always like, it's kind of like you're saying about you being from the East Coast. I mean, I'm from Chicago, but for me, me being a Cubs fan, I could still hang out with my friends who are Sox fans. I'm not worried about them wanting to cut my head off because of that. So so I think what it is I think it's I, a lot of times I also look at who's posting a lot of who's posting a lot of these like anti-Israel, anti-colonialism, anti-Zionism. Zionists are the devils. I kind of look at these people's profiles, and I'm not judging them, but a lot of them are taking selfies in parts of like Africa and Asia, and they're basically in front of like a hut, like a little village. So what I'm seeing is it's interesting that people from basically like corners of the world that have mega 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 poverty, right? And that's a whole different conversation about a lot of countries in terms of being able to be economically self-sufficient, but unfortunately a lot of their people are still living in poverty. So it's just mind-boggling that these people are living in poverty. They have access to the internet, and all they can show for it is their hate. And it's really unfortunate, because the question is, why aren't people with messages, more positive messages, more progressive messages, more messages of like love and compassion, why aren't these messages being promoted to like the corners of the world? And I think it just comes down to just human evolution, that it's much easier to follow the crowd and be a victim and have victim consciousness than be an independent thinker. And I think this is what you're seeing. I think what you're seeing, like with what's going on college campuses, with all these pro Hamas 72 virgin wannabes. I see what you're seeing with all these college professors. I think what you're seeing is, I think at the end of the day, a lot of these people, they're missing something inside. So it's easier for them to say something where they could be felt sorry for, rather than actually focus on the truth. And I mean, that's just kind of how I'm looking at it.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to say where all this winds up. I mean, I do think ultimately the truth wins out, but maybe not. Um, the October 7th, 2023 massacre, or the Hamassacre, as I like to call it, the Hamassacre, um, is was its own thing. And to ignore that, I'm just always mystified that people have been able to, you know, try to play that into some aggression against Gaza. And they've missed, there's, it's a war of words, to call this thing the genocide, the genocide of Palestinians, when the number of people in Gaza has grown, massively under, this coexistence, or whatever you want to call it, side by side duality with the state of Israel, which effectively enables them ships over water and food and whatnot. It's kind of an odd kind of genocide where you're feeding your enemies. But lately they're kind of retrenching the numbers, that it wasn't really, women and children being targeted. They're incidentally targeted, if at all, because Hamas puts them out front, shields their own people and whatnot. Which way do you think that war is going, as it were, and what are the changes you think that have happened, since the new presidential takeover here?
Well, I think what you're seeing, or what you saw, that the second Israel gave Hamas a little bit of breathing room in terms of the so-called ceasefire and everything, they started to regroup and rearm. I mean, that's really their intention. And I personally don't think you could ever negotiate with people like Hamas and ISIS. I mean, I think everybody needs to go. I mean, it's I'm not a proponent of just random firing squads and killing people, but when you have an ideology that's pretty much there to not only it not only kill like Jews, because a lot of the people that they killed, I mean, there were Arab Muslims that were killed. There was Arab Muslims that were kidnapped at the Gaza and killed. There were Thais that were kidnapped and or killed. You look at that whole situation, and I think that it's a real tough situation for Israel, because I do think that I think they are going to accomplish their goals. And I think that I'm very concerned though about how many hostages are left. In general, I hope the living ones are alive, but I mean, who knows? But I all I could tell you is, people look at that whole situation, and once again, like what you're saying about how people are saying, well, Israel's been doing this to the Palestinians for X amount of years and blah blah blah, and it's a ludicrous thing, because every time we wanted to give them a two-state solution, they say no, and they start intifadas and start throwing rockets. But one of the issues that I also have with the whole Gaza thing, it's kind of like me being in the entertainment business, or trying to be in an entertainment business, or whatever's left of the entertainment business, or Hollywood. It's you see all these the same type of people or women who are out there marching with their little pink hats and Me Too, and anti-rape, anti-female sexual assault. None of them were saying a word um, in terms of what happened, with all the rapes and sexual violence that happened during October 7th. I mean, no, you do have a few handful of celebrities that have come out, but the majority of them, I mean, they're just quiet, and you got to ask yourself, why? Why is it so selective? Why is it so selective on that?
And it's because they're fear, because frankly, terror works. Yasser Arafat died a wealthy man. He, I guess, was an engineer. He was born in Cairo. If you look at childhood pictures, he was, I don't think he was impoverished. He, dressed nicely and whatnot, and little jackets and ties. And, but, his occupation was not engineering, unless you want to consider engineering, an intifada, engineering. But, the amount of accord and respect and reverence he got as a terrorist was incredible. Because people don't want their things blowing up. They all have nice things. And so this, being a force of terror is potent, and it is kind of an amazing thing to see all the willful idiots, gays for, queers for Palestine, that kind of stuff, where they'd be the first one, gunned down or thrown off a roof or whatever. it's just an amazing inimical thing that supposedly, I call it when liberal pieties collide. It's not my term, but you're all for X, Y, and then Z comes along and it's totally discordant with X and Y. So if you're into women's rights or I don't know, gay rights or whatever, and then all of a sudden you have this intersectional, rock paper scissors where it's much more important to be for the other, who's being colonialized, where that all those other things fall by the wayside. You can't hold two thoughts at once. So you go for Hamas, which doesn't have any democracy. It's like, oh, save our democracy. Trump is a fascist, whatever. And you go to places clearly the most fascist place on earth, practically, where there's only, you have a uni party, and it's the theocracy, and any other kind of opinions. If you're basically a Muslim in Hamas, we saw lately, and you protest against Hamas, you're dead. So, if Douglas Murray argues that Hamas is actually worse than the Nazis, because the Nazis had to hide their Jew killing. They had to deny it at the time. They didn't let it get out, and the people would not have been uniformly enthusiastic. Some people might have, but it would have been kind of the rabid Goebbels like Nazi party, brown shirt riffraff, whatever, who were virulent, who didn't have jobs beforehand, and they're kind of like the thugocracy, and they take over, whatever. They might have been enthusiastic, but people in general, like regular polite society, who go to the theater, the opera, or just have run a newsstand or whatever, they wouldn't have been in favor of like slaughtering the Jews. I mean, some of it happened out in the open, but kind of the routine, machine of killing Jews would not have been applauded. Whereas you could do that in Gaza. You could probably have, Auschwitz, if Gaza, engineered one. You could have it right out on Main Street, and people would like be, hunting down people to contribute. I don't think it's quite the same thing.
Well, yeah, but what you're seeing though, when once again, when you're seeing like, you know, professors or students where they're celebrating what happened with October 7th, when you're seeing people who aren't there, you know, partying and being happy and saying, this was such a refreshing thing. This is amazing what happened on October 7th. And it's all over the world. That's like that's like a problem. I mean, that's like a serious problem. And the problem then I think it also comes down to is, how complicit is the media in all this? And the media, it's very complicit. You look at the way things are reported, even like with with the typical extremely left, like the CNNs of the world, and they're always saying how Israel, bombed, Israel, all these little kids are getting killed and women are getting killed, and it's like, well, yeah, that sucks, but they have guns pointed at their heads by their Hamas overseers who are using them as human shields and everything, and no one talks about that. It's really amazing how the lack of like any type of human rights, or that Gaza has had under Hamas since, what is it, 2005, 2006. No one's ever protested that. No one's, no, but it's like, go ahead. I'm sorry. So, on a side note, so I was in Israel right before October 7th happened. It was like the first time I went there as an adult since I lived there as a baby. And I happened to talk to a few. I remember I was talking to this one bartender at this bar that I was at. Some young kid, I don't know, he's like 23, 24, and he was telling me that he's in the military, he's in combat, and I started asking him. I started asking him a lot of things, and and he was just telling me how some of the missions that they would go into, like in the West Bank, or in Gaza or whatever, like special missions to get the terrorists. He's telling me that these terrorists are living in these palaces, these mansions with six Lamborghinis in front of, so where's the colonialism and the oppression for this? You know, it was just mind boggling. And I was just like, really? It was like my first or second day there. And then on the third day, I was going on this trip all over, through Israel. And I was just shocked what I saw. Like, I went to, I was going up to this one It was by this one Arab village. I think it's called Shafran. It's like in northern Israel and everything. And I was going through it, and there was like, it's an Arab only city. I mean, they've got an Apple store, Burberry, Nike store. And I'm like looking at this. And remember, I mean, I'm Jewish. I'm now an Israeli citizen too, but that's a different story. And it's the first time that I'm exposed to this. And I'm thinking, oh, the media is saying, oh, colonialism, oppression. It's ridiculous. I saw, women, in Islamic, Muslim women wearing headscarves or driving, Teslas and Porsches and Ferraris. I went up to a place in Israel, Pekin, to see, the cave of, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that whole area. I mean, it's pretty much Arab, and they're driving, Mercedes and Ferraris, and I'm like looking at all this. And then I remember I was on a train from Haifa back to Tel Aviv, and I was sitting next to this Arab woman with her little baby, and I was talking to her. I go, what do you do? She's like, oh, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. And I'm like, huh? She's like, yeah. She goes, yeah. I go, where'd you go to medical school? She goes, no, Haifa. Then I find out something like 50 or 60% of like the doctors and pharmacists in Israel, they're Arab Muslims. So so I'm just like, yeah, I'm just like, so I'm like, I mean, this is like real world stuff. I mean, I'm just curious, in terms of their thinking, and so it's really fascinating. So I'm just saying that going back where what you're seeing is, it's like, the Arab Muslims who live in Israel and who are normal, not radicalized, they'll never want to move from Israel. That's the greatest country in the world for them, you know. But the ones like in the section of Gaza, and they could have turned Gaza like into another Dubai and like to another Singapore. They took those billions and billions in dollars in aid for like the last 20 years, and they turned it into a graveyard terrorist cemetery, and now they're blaming Israel and the Jews for it when it was their own people.
You know,
So
they have the Gaza underground, the Gaza metro, I guess they call it. And so if they literally had made a metro like in Paris, they could have taken those billions of dollars and had the place connected, and I don't know, had a monorail or something like that. But instead, they made terror tunnels, and so that's always been this. It's basically it's a weaponized population and mentally and so forth. And the PLO and Hamas differ slightly. There's a joke. The big difference is the PLO wants to kill all the Israelis and throw them into the sea, and Hamas wants to torture them first. But it's like, I think, mentioned Dubai and Singapore. I think if Dubai could change one for one its real estate with Gaza's, they would do it in a heartbeat. They have the money, they have the oil money, and if they could keep that and pick a geography, they would be so much better to be sitting on the Mediterranean. And I think Dubai's got really crappy geography, but they've done a lot with it. It's unbearable to be outdoors, 6 months of the year during the day. It's like brutally Death Valley kind of hot. I spent moments in that, neck of the world on a transit somewhere else in Asia, but, it's unbearable. You can't be outside, during the day in the summer. It's just, you can't, it's just, you would die, within a couple hours without air conditioning or something like that. And, so it's a nice spot, but no, they're not going to build, Dubai by the sea. They're not going to build Singapore by the sea, the Mediterranean, whatnot. And they could, the Greek Isles do pretty well. I think Gaza has better beaches. They could, do fine, but they don't. So, the whole thing's weaponized, and it kind of brings up the question of, so let's say you get rid of all the guys who are quote unquote Hamas as soldiers and whatnot, sit back 5-10 years, you're just getting the kids who've been indoctrinated for the same thing and now have like a bigger vendetta, so forth. I don't know where it all ends. I mean, this concept of what's called genocide or ethnic cleansing, let's leave genocide aside for a second. Ethnic cleansing is a bad word in our terminology, but every place in Europe, if it is, Slovenia, if it is Belgium, if it is, I guess Belgium, the different groups in it, but all these countries are carved out based on ethnicity. And then ordinarily, when you win a war, you say, okay, you don't want to be part. You become part of this country or you leave. Canada, when the British took over from the French, there was Acadia. My wife's family's from up there in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and whatnot. They're like, well, you can stay and be under the British crown, or you want to do your own thing, then leave. And so they shipped the Acadians, or they put them on. They didn't kill them, but maybe some combatants, but they put them on boats. And the Cajuns in New Orleans and whatnot are from Acadia up in Canada. And so that has led to relative peace in the region. But then this brings up the question, like, where do they go? Nobody wants the Gazans. The Palestinians, as it were, even before Hamas, when they go someplace, they tend to, make trouble. I mean, they got kicked out of Jordan. There's Black September, and they got booted out of Jordan. I don't know. There are a lot of Arab countries, as it were, certainly a lot of Muslim countries. Where do they go? What's the answer demographically, geographically, politically?
Have all the people that are protesting here in the United States, have them take them in. Seriously, if they're so
Oh, that
no,
would that,
seriously,
that would
walk
yeah, that would
walk
make the
walk
United
this.
States Gaza.
Oh, God forbid. No, walk the talk. No, seriously, everyone's got this, lopsided, lopsided, validity to the cause. But when it comes down to actually doing something, they'll disappear. They won't do anything. It's kind of like, but you're right. Unfortunately, like, when you're seeing interviews with women in Gaza, where they're saying, Alhamdulillah, I hope my child becomes a martyr for Hamas. That's a problem. Okay. When I I know of people whose kids are from the United States, and they were like lone soldiers, and they went to fight in Gaza. And some of the stories they were telling me, sometimes you might hear about it on a Twitter feed, but you don't hear it in the mainstream. Almost every house in Gaza has an Arabic copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. I mean, that's a problem. Okay. So it's like when the kid comes home from Hamas preschool 101, and he's looking at, an Arabic copy of Mein Kampf, and they all have pictures of the Temple Mount in their house, thinking it's going to be theirs one day. And they're storing weapons in babies' bedrooms. It's a problem for future generations. So it's kind of like a lot of these kids, by the time they're 6, 7, 8 years old, it's over. I mean, they're gone. They're brainwashed. So unfortunately, and then that's probably one of the reasons nobody in the Arab or Muslim world, okay, nobody wants to take them in, because they know this. They know that, okay, we'll take in, let's just say we take in the kids. Well, the kids are 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. They're already radicalized. They're gone. What happens in, like, when they hit 17, 18, 19? Where do those ideologies you know come up in the real world? So it's a very tricky situation. I mean, look, there's enough land, if it comes down to it, for for them to relocate. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to anything else. It comes down to any other type of legal migration or immigration. What purpose would someone serve if they're moving to another place? And if their only purpose is, oh, well, I could teach you jihad, that's not a purpose. So,
So let's switch geographies a little bit because you have some passing knowledge, I assume, and history familiarly with Ukraine. And what's going on with that war? What are your thoughts about it? And how do you think the famous Zelensky Trump Vance meeting went?
well, so a little bit, on my family's history. So my family, we're all from Ukraine, going many, many generations back. According to the history of my family and millions of other, you know, Jews who are fleeing that part of the world, like Ukraine and the pogroms, there was a lot of there was a lot of massacres that are being committed there. in terms of like the pogroms. And during, World War II, something like 1.5 million Jews were killed in Ukraine, and the majority of the people that were, firing the guns, they weren't the Germans, they were the locals, in terms of the local Ukrainian police and collaborators and everything. So so I guess the reason I'm saying this is you have all these people. So anyone who's come to this country, whose family is from there, experienced that in one way or another, whether it was like the pogroms, whether it was, the Holocaust, Babi Yar, rampant, communism and anti-Semitism. Not even so much communism, but mostly like anti-Semitism. Like my mom, she couldn't go to law school. She couldn't become a lawyer in Ukraine because she was a Jew, right? And that affected a lot of people. So for me, coming to the United States in Chicago in the 70s and growing up, I was surrounded, I grew up in an area of Chicago called West Rogers Park. And then it was Lincolnwood. So they were kind of like next to each other. And the majority of people there, they were mostly, immigrants from, like Russia, Ukraine, I mean, Serbia, Croatia, Greece, Korea. So, we were all growing up, but the Russian speakers who were from like Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania and Belarus, no one ever identified us as Ukrainians or Belarusians or Russians. We were all Russians across the board. Okay. And whenever somebody would ask us, what are you? We'd be like, oh, we're Russian, we're Russian, we're Russian. And, the amount of like abuse, I guess, or bullying that I got, well, I really don't call it bullying. I call it setting the stage for me learning Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and Thai boxing. But for me, the amount of like, you dirty Russian that I heard since I was a little kid was nonstop. You dirty communist, you dirty Russian, go back to Russia. People would call me, they would call me urine because my name is Yuri. I mean, I'm laughing about it now, but that's the reality. People would say things to me like, "Hey, Yuri, go to a cliff and drop off," as in terms of Yuri on drop
You're
off
in
and
drop off.
stuff.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah, yeah, but that's okay. And then, and then I would wait for them after class, and there were fights, all everyday fights because of that. I mean, literally, people. But I wasn't from Russia. I was from Ukraine, whatever you want to call it. So my whole point is, we're all growing up. All the people, all the immigrants growing up, they're all going to Russian restaurants, all going to like, all speaking Russian. The food is the same across the board. And then one day, a few years ago, this whole thing happens, right? This whole, Ukraine Russia thing happens. And my God, people who've known each other for like 30 years, 40 years, they came here when they were like me. They came here like 3, 4, 5 years old. They start hating on their other friends who are, not Ukrainian or Russian. They start dividing themselves up. Well, I'm Ukrainian, you're Russian, you're from Belarus. That means you're on the side of Putin. It was the most convoluted thing, and I saw there was something very, very odd about the whole situation. It just didn't make sense. That there was Russian, so-called Russian restaurants in Chicago that were being attacked by like, fresh off the boat Ukrainian immigrants, and saying, "Oh, you're Russian, you support Putin," and it turns out a lot of these Russian restaurants were owned by Ukrainians. And I remember one guy, he posted something saying, "Yeah, I have a Russian restaurant," and I was like a high-ranking, military guy in the Ukrainian military 20 years ago. So you have like this whole convoluted, like, again, like what I'm saying, it's like taking sides, hate without reason. And it's like we're all living in the United States. We're all living in like a civilized country, and it was a very odd thing. And it like the whole thing was just very like just convoluted in terms of like a local thing. And and became, I need to share this because I'm in two things I need to share, and then I'll elaborate. So I'm in Los Angeles, and I used to live in this one building, and there was a woman there, and she was Ukrainian. And one day she starts talking to me. She starts asking me, where I'm from. And I told her, and she's like, "Oh," and right away she looks at me and she goes, "Slava Ukraina." And I'm like looking at her, and she's like, she goes, say it. I'm like, what? She goes, say it. And I'm like, why would I say it? And she's like, well, because you're from Ukraine. You have to say Slava Ukraina. And that's like their, I guess, their the battle cry where you see all the protesters saying Slava Ukraina. But it's like what people don't realize, including a lot of celebrities that I see seeing this, is that Slava Ukraina is pretty much like the Ukrainian Heil Hitler. That that word, and I'm probably going to get probably half my Facebook is going to delete me after this, which I don't care. But Slava Ukraina, I think it originated in a poem in the 1800s by a guy named Taras Shevchenko. I think that was his name. But what happened was during like the Ukraine, Russian Civil War, under I think his name was like Poltura. He was heavily involved with the pogroms and killing hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine, like in the 1920s or whatever. That was like the national like that was like the national like battle cry, Slava Ukraina. And then like under in World War II, there was this guy named Stepan Bandera, and he was under Hitler, and he was a Ukrainian, and his favorite one of his favorite hobbies was to organize killing Poles and Jews. And under Bandera, they were saying, Slava Ukraina. And unfortunately, in modern Ukraine today, you've got streets named after Bandera and Poltura, and they're like national heroes, which is really odd. So I have never been to Ukraine since I left when I was a baby. I have friends from there. I have friends who go there. They tell me what's going on. It's nothing like what the media suggests. But at the same token, I mean, this whole situation, it's not about anti-Semitism. I'm just saying, from my family's history and the family history of a lot of immigrants who came here, what it's about. So the other issue, with what's going on over there, which is really odd, it's like the whole thing. It actually reminds me of like the whole pro-Hamas things, where you have all these Ukrainians, they're protesting in the streets, Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. It's like, what do they want? I mean, what exactly are these people want? I mean, we've given, the United States has given, Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars for the last 2 years. I'm not talking about what happened in the last 26 years when when the Soviet Union fell, and Ukraine had plenty of time to become an economic powerhouse. And Ukrainians and Russians, not too much difference in terms of brains. I mean, these are people who are very intelligent. And instead, after 20, 26, 25, or how many years after the wall fell down, 30 years actually, probably more, when the Soviet Union came down, you know, they couldn't, most of the country, it's poverty. You've got a small percentage that's very wealthy. And so basically, who stole all that money in the last 30 years that they were getting from international aid? Where did that money go? That's the question that I have. The other question is, I'm like driving down the street here in Beverly Hills. There's homeless people, homeless encampments everywhere, and everything. No one's fixing that, but we're gonna fix, a problem over there. No one is fixing the fentanyl problem in the United States. It's killing, millions of people and millions of kids, but we're gonna go fix that. And then the other issue that I have is, which is really odd, because I came back to LA about a year and a half ago. I was traveling. I was actually living in Europe. I was living in Budapest, Hungary. That's another story. But so I'm walking in Beverly Hills here in Santa Monica, and there's a lot of young Ukrainian men. Ukrainian men fresh off the boat. They're shopping at Gucci. They're shopping at Fendi. They're shopping at Armani. They're driving expensive cars, and none of them are serving in the Ukrainian army. They all took off. So the question is, who's serving in the Ukrainian army? If my tax dollars as a Ukrainian immigrant if my US tax dollars are being used to send money and aid to Ukraine, who's serving in that army for Ukraine while while other people are are shopping in Beverly Hills, and it's really, and you look at all these protests, these people, these Ukrainian protests, these people are protesting during the day. None of them, if you ask them, will you ever go back to Ukraine, none of them will go back to Ukraine. If they really wanted to help Ukraine, they'd get on a plane and they'd work as, I don't know, like medics, or they'd work in preparing food. None of them will do that. They go drive back to their suburban houses, and then at night, you know where they're going? They're going to the Russian restaurants to dance. And and on that note, I also want to say, this other woman that confronted me about saying, Slava Ukraini in the building. After she said that to me, I looked at her. I said, "Okay, I'll think about saying that, but you have to say I'm Israel High. I want to make sure you support Israel." And her response to me right away was, "Well, I don't know too much about that situation. I could only focus right now on Ukraine." I'm like, "Oh, okay." But the interesting thing about it is, after I had my little chat with her, she's holding like a bag of groceries, and it was from like a Russian store in Los Angeles. And she looks at me, she's like, "Oh, look at all these, like, like Russian, like, dumplings she bought and all this stuff." And I'm thinking to myself, "You're telling me how horrible Russians are, how I'm supposed to how" she also accosted me because she heard me listening to some song. It was like a Russian song on YouTube. And she's like, "How dare you listen to a Russian artist on YouTube? They're gonna get royalties." But she's shopping at a Russian store buying Russian food the same time she's telling me this stuff. So the level of hypocrisy that's there, it's just crazy. Now, getting back to what you asked me about this whole meeting with Zelensky and Trump and all this other stuff. Well, of course, all the victims, who want everyone to feel sorry for themselves because they weren't hugged enough by their parents when they were kids, are saying, "Oh, well, Zelensky, he was bullied, he was set up." And I'm thinking to myself, if you're in like business or you're in politics and you're talking to someone who's at this point the most powerful person in the world, right? Whether you love him or you hate him, this is the Trump is the most powerful person in the world right now, and you want to negotiate some kind of concessions or peace or something. You don't tell the most powerful man in the world you're going to regret what you're doing and you're going to feel what we're feeling for years to come. You don't say that to you don't even say that to like, I don't know, like a guy, working at a gas station. Or I mean, it was just a flat out like F you. And I think, I mean, I don't know how they could have handled it. What should have their response should have been? They pretty much said, "Listen, guy, you're coming to the White House. You're coming to our country. You're asking us for aid. We'd like to know where this aid is going, right? Um, and you're now telling us how we're gonna feel." It was just so. It was just very. There was like really. It was very classless, and it was very tacky, and it just showed again that you know how the world is praising Zelensky to be like this hero, and he could win an Academy Award for playing that part. But a lot of people don't realize that when he was like running for president of Ukraine, he did it as a joke. And I think the name of his political party was the name of his film production company in Ukraine. I mean, and he got it. I also don't think that when he became president, I don't think he realized that this was the direction that this was going to go into. And I think there's a lot of people above him that we don't know about that are pointing guns at his head and that are pointing guns at his family's head, and they're saying, "You're going to do what we tell you to do." And that's really, I think, what's happening right now. because it's just because the whole situation, once again, people are saying, oh, Russia, the big bad wolf, the big bad bear, it attacked Ukraine. Well, okay, on a physical level, on a military level, they did it. I mean, there's no denying that. But then the question remains, if you have a neighbor, for example, like if people have neighbors, a lot of people all over the world, they have neighbors they call the psycho. They call the neighbor the psycho with the guard dogs that are unhinged. Do those neighbors provoke that psycho neighbor? No, they avoid him. So let's say the argument becomes on the side where people are saying, well, Putin is bad, he's a psychopath, he's a tyrant, he's a dictator. Let's say people believe that argument. Why would you want to provoke somebody like that? I mean, what do you think you're going to get out of it?
Yeah, no, it's the same
So,
thing. It's the same thing that he did with Trump. It's like I think there's a weird kind of provocative thing. It's almost like small man syndrome. I mean, he's much shorter than I realized before, and it's like this kind of outward bravado to keep people from noticing your weaknesses. And Zelensky, um, you know, kind of very, very improbable story. He's if you look at some of his early videos, I mean, they're very bizarre. He's got these, he dresses up as a woman. He's got high heels. He's dancing,
oh yeah,
and there's certain
yeah,
talent there. I mean, there's a certain kind of extroverted acting talent that I may not have. Fine, but the world of diplomacy, I think, is something that came artificially too easy for him. It's almost like what I call beautiful woman syndrome. When a woman is young and beautiful, everything she says, guys all nod to. They're like, yes, yes. A beautiful woman says, the sky is pink. It's like, yeah, it's sort of pink. I can see that because guys want to get in. And Zelensky was kind of a hot ticket, and became that thing that wasn't Russia. And I think Russia has been the rotten apple of the West's eyes for some time because he's not part of their overall political agenda. The kind of the woke agenda and the rainbow flag and all that kind of stuff. And he's sort of an old school holdout for girls being girls, girls and boys not being interchangeable. And I don't think he's vastly religious, but he's holding out to more kind of traditional ideals and whatnot. If you walk on the streets, I mean, I haven't walked, but if you watch the videos on the streets of Russia, they don't have the crime problem that you see in the West. They don't have beggars in the street. They don't have homeless. They don't have this. They don't. So it's sort of like a 1950s version of Europe, and Europe in its 2020s version of itself, doesn't like that kind of reflection. And almost like the way the Soviet couldn't look at things from the West in the time. Now the current West can't look at things that aren't woke. And so they want to expunge it. They want to like peel the plank out from their eyes and not see that. And so everything has to be anti-Putin, wherein, when in fact it was the real enemy as a Soviet Union, they didn't really have that same animosity. The weird thing is the Soviet fell and the whole threat of, nuclear war or the Russian tanks overrunning Germany, whatever, that dissipated. The whole Soviet bloc, Warsaw Pact dissolved. And so there were no tanks, sitting surrounding Berlin anymore. Well, that should have been wonderful. And it should have been applauded. And at a certain point, Putin wanted to join NATO, but he was told no. Yet Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia could. Yet, Poland can. Yet all the other Slavic states, whatever they can. All the former Soviet states or statelets were allowed in, but not Russia. And at a certain point, they're like, well, I think you have something against us. And clearly they do. And clearly there's kind of this NATO expansion. But for what? Like, what is NATO being threatened by? It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization against the Warsaw Pact. And that they were formed nearly simultaneously in 1947 or so. And one was counter the other. Well, the Warsaw Pact disappeared. Maybe there should have been some third, newer buffer entity for the Slavic states that were former Warsaw Pact. But in point of fact, they joined NATO, such as it is. And they were, Putin was promised that, and I think Gorbachev was promised that NATO wouldn't move an inch, to the east after the Warsaw Pact dissolved and Soviet fell, and that wasn't the case. And people don't realize that the mere geography. There's the Ural Mountains, which kind of separate East Europe from parts of Russia and whatnot. Well, that Ukraine, there's nothing. Ukraine is like Nebraska. It's like Nebraska and Kansas, traveling up to Chicago. There's no, there's no physical barrier between Omaha and Chicago. And so, if Omaha is Kiev and Chicago is Moscow, there's no physical impediment there. There's some roads and whatnot, and it's all flat plain. The whole thing's being fought out in the open, and it's kind of an absurdity because I think Russia has its own demographic squeeze where they're not producing young people anymore, and the population not what it once was, and the Soviet Union's not there anymore and whatnot. So they have their own issues and whatnot. But to allow like NATO tanks in Kiev, where there's like they're hop, skip, and a jump, easy pathway, flat plains up to Moscow. That's too much. And I think your point about having some schizo psycho neighbor next door. Yeah, you don't want to provoke them too much. People, on the subway, and some guy comes in, he looks a little bit scabby and scummy, and whatever, and is twitchy, and yeah, you don't go spit on his shoes. I mean, it's like there's certain kind of probity and propriety you have to like manage if you're in that kind of neighborhood. And I think we overpromised and we sort of semi delivered to the Ukrainians, but I don't think that can go on endlessly because they don't have the numbers to even match the kind of anemic numbers of Russia, because Russia, anemic as it is probably 3 times bigger population wise than Ukraine, or maybe more. And so, and mind you, the Ukrainians are not there. The Western Ukrainians are not really part of the war, and a lot of them have left. I don't know, kind of like the Syrian exodus of working class, soldier class men. They're just not there. So they don't have the soldiers to churn through. And then it becomes who's going to do it? There's a lot of talk in Europe, who's taking like that Russian woman, the Ukrainian woman, whatever, buying Russian products. They're buying, all the Russian gas and whatnot. They're tearing down their nuclear plants in Germany so they can buy gas, and gas products and whatnot from the Soviet to heat their homes. It's like it makes no sense, and everything comes down to like as long as we become the big daddy supporting all this stuff, then the children can go run amok and play and abscond with a certain amount of kickbacks for Porsches and whatnot for themselves.
Well, here's the thing, real just to kind of elaborate. So that's the one thing I want to say. If you were to send every wish list, you know, um, weapon to Ukraine from a manpower perspective, they from a manpower perspective, they would never be able to beat in a true, front battlefield scenario like the Russian army. There's too many people. That's number one. Number two, it's just mind-boggling how I believe that 2 weeks after the whole war began, I think they wanted to stop it, but I don't know if it was like Merkel or Biden. They're like, no, 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 keep going. And this whole time it was so disgusting because Biden kept saying we must beat Putin, we must beat them, we must beat them. And I'm thinking, never once in 3 years did he actually pick up the phone and say, okay, let's talk. Why
Yeah.
didn't Biden and Kamala one time pick up the phone and say, let's talk, let's have
Yeah,
an
because
agreement?
it's a business operation. I personally think
Yeah,
there's a lot of spin-off, there's a lot of kickback, there's a lot of fluff, a lot of graft, a lot of grift that's happening, and we throw the money over there, and some of it never gets there. Some of it goes to these operatives and these conduits. The kind of Hunter Biden model of collecting money as a conduit between American largesse and European recipients. So it's a scam, and we see this through USAID and a lot of things that are being uncovered now. Anyway, so we're rounding out our hour. I just want to ask you, as a Ukrainian American, what you thought of Alexander Vindman and the first Trump impeachment.
again, I personally think, here's a guy who, Ukrainian Jew immigrant, comes to the United States, has that gift, has the gift of having the brains and the grit, to get a great education, join the military, and and then flip the switch. And it was just a very, forget whether it was him. It was like that whole like domino falling effect of all these people trying to, you know, backstab him and attack him for their own, I guess, without merit. So it doesn't really matter if it was him. It doesn't matter, who it was. I think right now, as I said, people are asking me, well, do you support Trump? Do you not support Trump? It really comes down to one thing and one thing only. How is this country, becoming better collectively, um, internally and externally? And unfortunately, I think from a global perspective, I think America has the potential to evolve and grow and really be like a global economic, powerhouse. I just think that what happened inside the country in terms of between the people here in the United States, and this started before Trump. I think this started to really fall when Obama came to power, well, power, when he became president, where the where the distance here, between people, it's really far, and it's getting farther and farther and farther. And that's really the sad thing, because this country was built on a collective, I guess you can call it, consciousness of building and love your neighbor, and on traditional, Judeo-Christian values. And now you just see this big separation between people, where every little minor micro sensitive thing completely makes you just hate everyone. And you see it not only between people, you see it in families, people, hating
Yeah.
each other
Well,
based on who they
I think
voted.
that's the Marxist seed. I think it's the way, if you're a small animal, the way you kill a big animal is bit by bit. You don't eat the whole cow all at once. But it's kind of a Marxian critical theory parasitic approach. If you want to get a big elephant down, if you get them in 18 different ways, drive them crazy, and parasite here, parasite there. So I think it's a divide and conquer technique, so that your ideas can forge ahead in the calamity and aftermath of destruction. So yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think the major political unit worldwide is the family, and that you see that's being split up and attacked and whatnot. And just the mere idea of forming a family is almost revolutionary for people who don't have firm grasp of male versus female and roles and all that kind of stuff. So I want to thank you very much, Yuri, for being on. Um,
Thank you. I appreciate
people
you inviting me. It was fun.
people can find you. There, your name is right there. You're on LinkedIn. You are on social media, or
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, I'm on Instagram, and if people actually go to my Instagram profile, I've got a video, just real quick, of me and myself when all the Hamas protests were happening by UCLA. I actually confronted a bunch of them, and everything, so they could see it on my Instagram profile, which is Yuri_Rutman. So I
okay. So
appreciate you
same
inviting
spelling.
me.
Sure thing. So before we go, just a quick self promotion here. If people want to help support the podcast, they can go buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika. Nothing to do with what we said. The pandemic that never was. Got a picture of me right on the cover, right here, as you can see. I don't remember. I don't remember recall if I was smiling or not. Let's see. Hard to tell. But it's
Movie
an
star,
interesting.
movie star.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. I think people should read it. Frankly, if they just buy it, that will help me. But even better if they read it and pass it along to their friends. So thank you so much. Stick around for a minute. We'll chat afterwards. But thank you and goodbye to everybody else.
Thank you. I appreciate it.